Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are finally continuing with my bite-sized archaeology series. It's now September, which means a bunch of you might be sitting in intro to archaeology classes or even teaching them and wishing that there were some short, easily digestible videos you could turn to for help on certain topics. I can't say that this is definitely gonna be that, but I'm at least gonna try. In the first few episodes of this series, many months ago, we talked about what archaeology is and the differences between artifacts, ecofacts, and features. I said in the last episode that we were going to talk about how these different archaeological finds are preserved, excavated, and studied, but then I realized that I haven't talked at all about how archaeologists even find these things in the first place. So today we're launching a bit of a mini series, or I guess a theme of several episodes within Bite-Size Archaeology, where we're going to be taking a look at the ways archaeologists find archaeological sites. Archaeologists use a lot of different methods to find archaeological sites, including crop marks, walkover survey, looking at historical documents and oral tradition, asking local people what they know about the area, etc., etc., etc. Today we're going to be looking at oral tradition and historical documents, since that's often where archaeologists start their search. So let's begin with oral tradition. Oral tradition is when people pass knowledge, art, ideas, cultural material, or other information from one generation to another through speech, song, theatrical performance, or any other form of verbal communication. Folk tales, traditional songs, ballads, and poems can all serve as part of oral tradition. Archaeologists often consult oral tradition, or at least records of oral tradition, to see what archaeological sites might be mentioned and what clues a particular song or tale might have to tell us about where that site might be. Also, just FYI, oral tradition can tell us loads of other things, but in this video I'm only focusing on how archaeologists use oral tradition to find sites. Oral tradition can provide the names of possible sites, important cultural figures who might be associated with that site, some information about how the site was used and why, where a site is, and it can also tell us a lot about sites that we didn't even know existed. Oral tradition is also really good for understanding how sacred or special a site is to a culture, which informs how we as archaeologists approach the site or whether we approach it at all. That all sounds great, and it is, but there are also some things to keep in mind with oral tradition. First, oral tradition may take place in a language that the archaeologist doesn't understand, or it might use abbreviations, expressions, or nuance that we don't pick up on. There are many cultures who use an entirely different language form when engaging in oral tradition than they do in their day-to-day lives, and that language form may not be possible to learn outside of the community that it's spoken in. Depending on the culture, the tales, songs, performances, and other forms of oral tradition may not be something an outsider is allowed to know or hear. If we don't have the permission to witness or use the oral traditions of a culture, then we can't use them, and that's okay. No culture is obligated to share all of their knowledge with academics or the wider world. Every culture is allowed to have sacred practices or even non-sacred practices that are simply reserved for members of that culture. Another thing to remember about oral tradition is that they may use a different concept of time and space to what scholars might expect. Time isn't always linear, for example, or at least humans don't always perceive time as linear. It can be cyclical, or it could be merged in ways that you might have difficulty conceiving of. Oral tradition isn't there to be useful to archaeologists, and the ways oral tradition conceives of things like time and space are also really important details in their own right. Also, keep in mind that oral tradition, like pretty much anything created by humans, is inherently biased. It was created to serve a purpose, so it's biased towards that purpose, whatever that purpose is. That means that we as scholars need to be aware of the potential for bias as we gather information from any particular piece of oral tradition. There are also some misconceptions about oral tradition that I want to just point out. First, many people from literate societies that don't currently have a practice of oral tradition tend to think that oral tradition isn't accurate, because in their minds, how could a culture remember everything from one generation to the next without fail? But actually, oral tradition is generally as accurate as written texts. Those who keep these traditions remember the details through memory aids such as mnemonic devices, rhythmic speech patterns, or turning the tale or information into a song or a poem. Verses, in many oral traditions, have the same number of syllables that are repeated and emphasized in a predictable fashion, so any error or change to the words is relatively easy to spot. One reason that people from literate societies tend to think that oral tradition isn't accurate is because they tend to assume, or they were taught, that oral tradition is the same as folk tales or folk songs. And those individuals know that many folk tales or folk songs in their own culture vary quite a bit between tellings. But folk tales aren't automatically oral tradition. Remember that oral tradition is passing knowledge, art, ideas, cultural material, or other information from one generation to another through speech, song, theatrical performance, or any other form of verbal communication. It's true that parents pass songs to their children in most societies, but many folk traditions don't mind if the lyrics or tune or rhythm changes. Oral tradition, on the other hand, generally has rules or practices in place to maintain the integrity of the original piece of oral tradition. When people think that oral tradition and folk songs or folk tales are always the same thing, it tends to come from a lack of experience with oral tradition and its characteristics. Sometimes, though, people go the other direction and assume that oral tradition can tell us everything about a culture, or that a culture's oral tradition contains all of the knowledge that society has about a particular subject. But there can be more recent pieces of knowledge that aren't part of oral tradition, or personal stories passed along in a less formal manner that can tell us about a site or what might be there. Oral tradition contains a lot of information, but it's also not the only source of information a culture or community has to offer if they would like to. So now that we've talked a lot about oral tradition, let's talk about historical documents. Historical documents are documents that contain important historical information about a person, place, event, or some other subject. There are two main categories of historical documents, and actually historical or archaeological sources in general, but let's talk about them in terms of historical documents here. These are primary sources and secondary sources. In terms of historical documents, primary source documents were created during the period being studied, while secondary source documents are documents that discuss information originally presented in another source. And that other source could be a primary source or another secondary source. Also, keep in mind that a source can be both primary and secondary at the same time. A newspaper article published in the 1980s talking about how New Year's was celebrated in the 1920s is a secondary source for New Year's celebrations in the 1920s, but it's also a primary source for how the media portrayed and/or understood the 1920s celebrations in the 1980s. Archaeologists use historical documents in much the same way as we use oral tradition. They provide information about a site or its location that can help us find the site and decide whether we want to excavate it, and if so, how. They can also tell us about sites we didn't know about yet and at least narrow down where those sites might be. Secondary sources also often provide information about what research has already occurred at or around the site, and they can show where gaps in our knowledge might be too. If any of these secondary sources are archaeological reports or discussions by people who have spent a lot of time in that location, they can also tell us about what we can expect at a site and whether there are any potential risks or dangers or weather patterns or what have you. Importantly, historical documents can also provide information about what kind of relationships scholars have had with local groups in the past. If archaeologists in the past were disrespectful or dismissive of the cultural norms, practices, and desires of local groups, then those local groups might not want to work with other archaeologists, and justifiably so. Knowing the context of past interactions between archaeologists and locals can significantly improve the working relationship of future archaeologists with the same groups, simply because we're aware of what happened in the past and can organize provisions to avoid pitfalls moving forward. As with oral tradition, there are some things to keep in mind with historical documents. First, again, as with most things created by humans, historical documents were created to serve a purpose. And that's often not the same purpose as what archaeologists and historians are using those documents for. That means that there is probably a difference between the information the document has and the information that we are looking to get from it. Because all historical documents are created for a purpose, they are also biased towards that purpose in the same way that oral tradition is. Part of being a good historian or a good archaeologist is recognizing those biases and how they might affect our understanding of the past. Importantly here, though, historical documents are physical documents, usually with some form of writing on them. This medium often favors societies that had or have a written form to their language, To combat biases for or against historical documents or oral tradition, our goal is to approach both of them equally and ascribe similar value to the information contained in each. And just like oral tradition, there are also some common misconceptions about historical documents. In Western society, there is a tradition of thinking that historical documents give an accurate account of events. While historians and archaeologists have largely moved past this notion, many people outside of the discipline still approach historical documents as absolute fact. But as I said already, every historical document was created for a purpose and will generally only include the information that is relevant to that particular purpose. If the purpose is to convince people that a terrible warlord is actually a stand-up person, then the document may not be entirely truthful about who that person is or what that person has done. Many people are more than prepared to look at historical documents of other nations or cultures and accept that those documents might not be accurate. Where people tend to struggle is in accepting that historical documents from their own nation or culture also might not be accurate. Similar to the issue with accuracy, there is a tradition of thinking that historical documents are also unbiased in their accounts. Like I just said, they were created to serve a purpose and only contain the information that is relevant to that purpose. So they're most likely going to be leaving out information that doesn't serve the purpose of the document. Many of these purposes are relatively benign, like ledgers marking what goods come through a major port or something, but many of them are more affected by these biases, like that discussion of a warlord being a stand-up person, or different accounts of a battle or a revolution. Similar to oral tradition, to combat these biases in historical documents, historians and archaeologists do what we can to acknowledge the biases in these documents and to minimize their effects on historical and archaeological research. And yes, that does include documents created by scholars in our own disciplines, and it even includes documents created by ourselves. So that is a very brief rundown of how archaeologists use oral tradition and historical documents to find archaeological sites, along with a few things to keep in mind for each of them. Honestly, oral tradition and historical documents are often one of the first resources archaeologists turn to when we're trying to find a site, but there are also loads of other ways archaeologists find sites. Next episode, we'll be talking about crop marks and parch marks and how we can find sites through a combination of those and aerial photography, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe down below. Also, as a fun aside, I actually stream on Twitch now too. Check out the link in the description if you're interested. At this point I stream at least once a week on Thursdays from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. UK time, so if you're interested, head on over and give me a follow. That's all from me for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!